Um, I really want to, before I enter into my remarks, I really want to just uplift the phenomenal work of Local First Arizona and my dear friend and collaborator and sort of fellow soldier in this work, Kimber Lanning. The state of Arizona is so lucky to have Kimber in Local First Arizona. I'm just so fortunate to be inspired by the work of the organization and, in particular, Kimber's leadership. And so before I enter into the conversation, and I'm so delighted to have this opportunity, I will admit something to everyone. Ashley spoke to it a little bit in her opening remarks, and I really sort of began to shift how I was going to have this conversation and to have this discussion today, given what has happened over the last 16 to 24 hours in this country. And I'm going to do my best. So please do bear with me as I again shifted a little bit of what my conversation would be in light of the news that Derek Chauvin, the police officer that uh, was was found guilty of murder of George Floyd yesterday, and yet that comes on that just a few moments later, a few hours after that, we discover that a 15-year-old black girl, Ma'Khia Bryant, was killed by a police officer in Columbus, Ohio. And so I'm sitting with that today because this conversation around transforming our economy, this conversation around the business case for social justice, it's really situated within a much larger context of the systems, the injustices that work against us on the day to day level. It's a reminder, despite the fact that there's some affirmation that Black Lives Matter today, given the verdict that was afforded to Derek Chauvin yesterday. But it's a stark reminder, though, that just moments after, and a call to the police in a response to a young Black woman uh, was killed. And so I'm not going to politicize this conversation too much. And this is not a conversation about the police, actually. But I do want to make sure that when we talk about transformation, when we talk about transformative systems, when we talk about a transformative economy, I really want to make sure that we're centering a discussion that's based on the systems that we all live through every single day and the choices that we make as individuals that sit within those systems. I'm having this conversation from my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland. And I want to begin this conversation with a little bit of context for how I've come to see the work and why I've done this type of work and why Common Future does the work that it does. And I'm going to tie it into, I'm going to thread the needle a bit here to what has occurred over the last few hours. Baltimore City is a remarkable place. It's about 64% African American. Um, it is also a place of, for those who are not familiar with it, it's clear it's known as a place that has many challenges, despite all its remarkable beauty and opportunities. I look at Baltimore and I've experienced it my entire life, having lived most of my time in the city, as really a true story of the American narrative over the past 30 to 40 years. Baltimore is a place in which you really experience and can see the impacts of social and economic and racial injustice. We see mass incarceration. We see over policing of Black communities in particular. We see what happens when quality jobs don't exist in communities. When you're more likely to see a police officer on the streets than you are likely to see someone having an opportunity for a job. There are communities in Baltimore, for example, that are experiencing upwards prior to the pandemic. I want to point out, prior to the pandemic, there are communities in Baltimore that experience 40 and 50% joblessness rates. That is a systemic issue that has plagued communities across the country. And the reason why I want to tie this together with what's happened over the last few hours, and this is really important, I think, is that the city of Baltimore, as one example, spends nearly $500 million, $500 million a year on its police budget. Similarly, the state of Maryland spends approximately $300 million a year on incarcerating Baltimore residents. So that is $800 million a year that is dedicated to ensuring that individuals in Baltimore City don't have economic opportunities. And why do I bring that up? Because when we think about the business case for social justice, when we think about transformative economies, what might it look like in a place like Baltimore that again is 64% African American, has had declining population for the last few decades? It's now under 600,000 residents. When I was growing up in my formative years in the 90s, it was well above 625,000 residents. When we look at the economic dislocations that has occurred, when we look at the fact that we used to have 9 banks in the state in the state of Maryland, 9 local and regional banks that are major institutions within the state of Maryland, and how the banking consolidation that's plagued us across the country has been particularly acute in places like Baltimore. When we look at these sort of issues, when we look at these types of challenges, it's extraordinary to consider the fact that we spend $800 million a year to incarcerate and police Baltimore City residents. What if we took just 10% of that to support localized and regional businesses that actually serve the interests of the majority African American communities in Baltimore, the working class, the majority working class and working poor communities in Baltimore? What if we took 10% of the budgets that go to policing and incarceration of residents of Baltimore City? I tie that to transformation because while there is a bit of reprieve from the fact that Derek Chauvin was convicted of murder of George Floyd, I'm also in a place in which 6 years ago, almost to the day, Freddie Gray, a young African American man, was killed while in police custody and did not get the accountability and justice served to him as was done yesterday. Freddie Gray grew up in a community not far from the very community that I grew up in. It's within walking distance. It's a community that did not have levels of investment that had been divested from for many decades. And when I think about the stories, the narratives of individuals like Freddie Gray, like George Floyd, I wonder again, what might it have looked like? What stories would we be saying today if instead of applying resources to negate the life opportunities of someone like Freddie Gray, we instead invested those resources into developing economic opportunities that ensured that Freddie Gray had an opportunity to have a good paying job, a job that would establish living wage for him and his family. That would be family sustaining wages. But that's not the story. So we'll never know. But I think about that when we have these conversations about transformative economies. Because really it begins to ask the question, we need to ask the question rather, of what is the purpose of our economy? For far too long, the economy has oftentimes been used as a tool to exclude and marginalize. And I know that those who are participating in this phenomenal convening that Local First Arizona has put on have a different mindset. I know that to be the case. And at the very same time, I ask all of you, and I ask myself this, what is the purpose of our economy? Shouldn't the economy be a vessel, a vehicle in which we create opportunity for all individuals, that we're able to build lifestyles that accommodate the well-being of of our neighbors, those down the street from us, strangers as well. But too often, the economy is used to do something distinctly different. And so when I think about transformative economy, I think about an economy that is put to use to ensure that the Freddie Grays, the George Floyds, the Micaiah Bryants have opportunities for living fulfilling lives. So I've set the stage for that and try to connect it to what's happened over the last few hours. At the same time, we find ourselves in this setting, this pandemic that has occurred for the last year plus. We have an opportunity to rewrite the rules, to do something different. If anything, there is a saying in the Black community, and it might be similar sayings in other communities as well, that when America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. We see this not just with Black communities, we see this with white working class communities, we see this with Latino communities, we see this in communities of color broadly. But I bring this up because I think so many of us, particularly the small business owners that are participating in this conversation today, have directly witnessed and experienced the pandemic as sort of accentuating the broader challenges that are put upon us by systems. And what do I mean by that? Prior to the pandemic, prior to 2020, as an example, it was projected that median household wealth for African Americans in the US would decline pretty sharply. That we were on a trajectory that by 2053, median household wealth for African Americans would hit zero. Let me repeat that. Prior to the pandemic, which has wrought so much pain to our economy, we were already predicting that by 2053, the median household wealth for African Americans would drop to zero. We're going to see this sort of precipitous fall in wealth and decline in household income in other communities of color quickly following. That was prior to the pandemic. Now we've had this economic pushback upon all of us, and again, particularly communities of color and white working class. And so, what does that look like now moving forward? I know many of you who are business owners or support business owners understand explicitly what I'm talking about. We know that, for example, based on a report that was issued by the Federal Reserve, I believe just last week, that Black and Latino owned businesses with low credit risk were approved for loans roughly at the same rate as white owned businesses with medium and high credit risk. We also understand that for minority owned businesses, there was a much steeper decline in success in business during the pandemic. 86% of Black owned firms, 85% of Latino owned firms, and 93% of Asian owned firms reported declines because that were related to the COVID-19 pandemic, compared to only 79% of white owned firms. We have a systemic challenge in our economy. That systemic challenge, while it is disproportionately impacting communities of color, Latino, Asian, African American, our indigenous brothers and sisters as well, and especially, I should say, these challenges also impact the white working class. It impacts white Americans as well. We oftentimes don't have that conversation, and we don't acknowledge it. And the reason why I want to acknowledge it is that I believe when we look at what's happening with our economy, we oftentimes point to the wrong villains in the story. This will be the first generation in which white Americans will not exceed the wealth and life prosperity as the prior generation. This is a story that African Americans and Latino and Asian Americans might be familiar with in other communities of color. But this is the first time that it'll be experienced en masse by by white Americans. The systemic challenges that have disproportionately impacted the working class, that have disproportionately impacted communities of color, they are continuing to perpetuate, and they've proven to adversely impact almost all of us. And the opportunity that we have with the transformative economy is to actually rewrite the rules. And what do I mean by that? Well, over the last year during the pandemic, we've seen a spectacular increase in wealth and concentration of wealth within the hands of a few corporations and individuals. While the stock market is doing well, depending on the day of the week, but overall, the stock market has been doing well. It hasn't reflected what's really happening in our local economies. It hasn't reflected what's happening in the day-to-day lives of Americans. There's a separate economy that we really don't have as much visibility into. We can experience it, each of us, those of us that are business owners, that are running organizations, that are entrepreneurs, we experience it, we feel it. It's not reported on. What's reported on, and when we talk about the health of the economy, is just oftentimes correlated to the success of the stock market, which by and large, as we know, those who own stock, who are in the public equities in this country, are predominantly not working class individuals, or not folks of color. And so there's a real disconnect in terms of the financial economy that is applauded as an indicator for the success of our economy, without really reporting and interrogating what is our economy doing for our small businesses, what's the economy doing for the majority of our workers, we don't see that level of detail. But during the spectacular increase in wealth for corporations, we also recognize that, as I said earlier, minority businesses were having declining revenues. We're seeing permanent shuttering of so many of our vital small and mid-sized businesses that are critical anchors within our communities. I just returned back to my hometown, Baltimore, just a few weeks ago. And when I walk around, when I go around and see how many of the businesses that I patronized for so long, for so many years, don't exist, have closed up shop, and those wonderful entrepreneurs that did so much for our community now having to reach back out to community to see if they can get some support in this moment as individuals now that their businesses no longer exist. None of that is reflected in the stock market, of course. And yet, we continue, when I say we, not the folks that are participating in this conversation, but by and large, in the media and policymakers, we have a lot of conversation about the economy in ways that don't really reflect the interests and means of those that live day to day. So while there's been spectacular growth in wealth and power in a handful of companies, corporations rather, and individuals, what does that mean for the rest of us? I know yesterday there was a conversation around employee ownership. There was a conversation around um, uh, incarcerated individuals and how to make sure that they're connected to real opportunities in our economy. When I think about the transformative economy, it's really focusing on our opportunity to not focus on the those that have the most, but creating equity, opportunity, and ownership for those of us who live day to day on the margins, or just striving for a middle class opportunity and lifestyle. So when I think about the work at Common Future, this is what we're about. We're really focused on making sure that we've created pathways and investing into opportunities that really challenge what our economy looks like. An economy that prioritizes workers, an economy that prioritizes the working class, the priorities that prioritizes people of color and communities of color, that makes meaningful investments into them, and asks the question, what might it look like in a place like Baltimore or a place like Arizona if we decided not to invest in things that restricted opportunity for our communities, but in fact perpetuated and created and sustained opportunities for our communities? A perfect example of this, one of the organizations in the Common Future Network, it's a wonderful organization called Runway, the Runway Project. The Runway Project was architected, created by a brilliant Black woman, Jessica Norwood, that recognized something several years ago. And I know that this will resonate for entrepreneurs in the audience today that are participating in this convening. What she recognized was that for African American entrepreneurs, there was a real gap in the friends and family financing that so many entrepreneurs and small business owners tap into to get their starts. Well, there's a massive wealth gap between white and African American households, and that wealth gap has directly implicates the friends and family financial capital that African Americans have access to. Now, this is on top of things like redlining of banks over the generations, not having access to banking opportunities. Um, Again, this is not just something specific to African Americans. I know that this is also true for many entrepreneurs broadly, for women, for entrepreneurs of color, for small business owners. But just recognizing that there is this opportunity to intervene, Jessica created the Runway Project as an opportunity, as a means to mitigate the issues that were facing African American entrepreneurs as it related to access to capital. And so the Runway Project, which is effectively an entirely Black woman led institution of entrepreneurs and artists and just brilliant minds, created a new financial product working with community development financial institutions and banks that effectively provides friends and family capital to Black entrepreneurs. They work with a number of entrepreneurs across the country to set the equity base that is required for them to begin their businesses. On top of that, last year, Common Future was able to provide support to the Runway Project to experiment with universal basic income for their entrepreneurs. Now, I know that it was very challenging last year to in terms of the monthly checks that are offered by the federal government. And what Runway Project recognized was that their entrepreneurs who weren't able to get into paycheck protection program, weren't able to have access to loans or grant capital from the federal government, created this universal basic income to provide the lifeline that entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs specifically, needed during this time. And we're really happy to be able to support that effort with the Runway Project. And what makes that transformative? It's transformative because it's centered on the interests and the needs and the means that were required for African American entrepreneurs, specifically Black women entrepreneurs as well. It recognized that the banking institutions, and unfortunately, there were challenges in our own government to actually fulfill the needs that were being experienced by these entrepreneurs. Well, let's try to fix it. Let's step into it. Let's make sure that we can create opportunities outside of these systems that are actually more exploitative and extractive. Similarly, we've been working with communities in our network, Indigenous and Black specifically, to develop different forms of financial capital in institutions that, again, deliver capital in ways that are meaningful for entrepreneurs like the ones that I believe are listening and having the conversation throughout these convenings. These are pilots, but we're working very diligently to ensure that there's opportunities for entrepreneur and small business support organizations in our networks that can actually deliver a type of capital that is essential for the businesses and entrepreneurs that they serve. Again, why is that transformative? It's because, again, we're centering the needs of these entrepreneurs and we're centering the needs of organizations like the ones that are participating in this conversation that know best what their entrepreneurs and communities need, what their small businesses need. We're not bringing in institutions from the outside that might be challenged to understand the unique needs of things happening in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or Cincinnati, Ohio. We're relying specifically on the insights and experiences, knowledge, the trust of organizations and individuals that already live in those communities. The other thing that I want to point out in this conversation with you all today is that the role for small business, medium-sized business, in terms of collective action could not be any more apparent and necessary than it is today. I mentioned earlier just how much concentration of power has happened in these corporations over the last month or the last year. And this is something that could continue to have a trajectory. One of the things that we think about a lot at Common Fusion, and one of the things that I think about personally, is how can we actually meaningfully organize businesses, both in the political and policy perspective, but actually, how do we make sure there's meaningful connections between businesses in ways that they can actually provide meaningful alternatives to the dominant economy and corporations that exist today? What do I mean by that? What might it look like, for example, and this is a question that we're in. Again, I mentioned employee ownership. What might it look like for businesses that are focused on the interest of the working class and communities of color, workers of color specifically? What might it look like if there were more cooperative processes that they could collaborate around, draw down more capital, again, collectively? Look at complementary means in which goods can be exchanged, that you can service your communities in different types of ways. Because I do think in this transformative economy, we do have an opportunity to rethink so much. In my experience, I found that we put so much weight onto the shoulders of entrepreneurs and small businesses. Again, we talk about them all the time in positive ways because they provide so much to our economy, to our livelihoods. But I'm of the belief that small businesses and entrepreneurs can't do it all on their own. We ask too much. And so, what are the collective ways? What are collaborative ways? Things that we explore in the Common Future Network and other places, our peers. What are ways that we can actually make it less challenging, less difficult for entrepreneurs and small businesses to succeed? Not go at it alone, but to build collectively, to have that connective tissue that really enables for greater levels and probability of success. That again allows for increased opportunity to bring in capital when necessary. We talk about worker owned cooperatives, we talk about all sorts of different things, but what might it look like for businesses to also operate in a more cooperative fashion? These are things that I know are of question and come up quite a bit in the Common Future Network. These are things that we concern ourselves with quite a bit. And the opportunity before us is significant. The reason why it's significant is because we can choose to leverage the opportunity that's been presented by this worldwide pandemic to either reimagine what our economy looks like and restructure what our economy looks like, or we can decide that we want to go back to normal. We want to go back to what it was back in February of 2020. But I don't think that's where we want to go. In fact, I know that's not where we want to go. We want to make sure that we have real meaningful ownership and opportunity in communities across the country, and obviously in Arizona, in which we're not just thinking about the individual needs of businesses or the owners of those businesses, but collectively think about how we can really reimagine and restructure what our economy looks like to, again, center those who have been most excluded. And the piece of this, again, that I think is really critically important for us to consistently go back to, because I know, particularly in the context to, of today, when there's been so much increased attention around racial equity, racial injustice, one of the reasons why we went from the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies to Common Future is because we believed there was a mutuality in our experiences. That just because we talk about race, just because we talk about gender, doesn't in fact mean that we're saying that there's not a role for white folks in this economy. It's actually not what we're saying. Instead, what we're saying is, how do we rewrite the economy in ways that actually is beneficial to the working class, to people of color, to communities of color, who actually share so much in common? There's been so much extraction and exploitation experienced by the white working class that's been experienced by communities of color. And so we actually have an opportunity right now, I believe, to reassess how the economy works for all of us and to put it to work for all of us. And actually identify the true villains of the story. This is not a time for us to actually segment ourselves, to separate, to be divided. This is an opportunity for all businesses, entrepreneurs, and communities to recognize that the economic system as it operates doesn't benefit all of us to the degree that we believe that it does. And it's in that shared understanding of how these economic, social, and racial injustices impact all of us, we will have an opportunity to transform our economy. We'll have an opportunity to make sure that, quite frankly, no matter your zip code, your race, your gender, your, where you went to school, that you have an opportunity in our transformed economy to really have a livelihood that is humane, that is collective, that ensures that you can be healthy and prosperous. And really, we believe that small businesses and entrepreneurs can be in the front of that charge to lead us in that transformation. And we need to recognize that it is in our mutuality that that opportunity can be fulfilled. And so, with that, I really just want to thank all of you for participating in this convening. I want to thank all of you for me having an opportunity to address all of you today. And I appreciate the patience that was afforded to me, especially as I've been sitting with what the last few hours means for us as a country. How does it impact me as a Black man in this country? As I said earlier, I'm exhausted a little bit, but I know that with entrepreneurs and small businesses like the ones that are in this conversation and in this convening today, and the organizations that support small businesses in Arizona, that there's a pathway for us to actually transform our economy and put it to work for all of us. So thank you.
Rodney, thank you so much for everything that you've brought to us today and for sharing your insights with us at Local First Arizona and our small business community. Just really appreciate the work at Common Future and the partnership with us here. Wanted to perhaps ask one question for you before we end here today. You've given us a lot of context and a lot of things to think about regarding, the makeup of the economy, who it works for, who it's continuing to work for, even in a national economic and pandemic crisis that we're coming out of. What can the business community do to participate in the transformation that you're talking about? What steps can we take? What can we learn from what's happened and what's happening to play a role in transforming it the way you're discussing today?
Really appreciate the question, Thomas. So there are many ways. I think for for larger businesses, there's an opportunity to actually ensure that you're working with smaller businesses, particularly minority owned or women owned businesses, giving them a shot, right? Um, Leveraging both your financial and social capital to be able to enable other businesses to come online. I find that to be really catalytic, particularly in this moment. We hear all these different like phrases like Black Lives Matter and things like that. Well, there's an opportunity for larger businesses to actually cash checks in terms of um, um, how they actually put things out there. The other thing I think is really important, Thomas, to think about is how can businesses make sure that their employees have an opportunity at the table for ownership. I think this is going to be a critical question moving forward, even if it's in the small ways, right? So employee ownership, I think worker ownership opportunities. Are there opportunities to engage with local and state governments around creating different financial mechanisms? And I think these are things, Thomas, obviously that Local First Arizona and so many of your participants are engaging in. But I think there are many ways, including, but I think one, if you're a larger business, how do you actually open up to have access available to smaller businesses? And then also, how do you actually create pathways for asset ownership for workers?
Great, great. And maybe one other question as it comes to mind before we let you go here today. Um, Looking out, as we recover from the past year, what do you see transforming? What do you see happening across the country? There are these systems that you named as you opened up that we all actively participate in. What is evolving within those systems, and how will we emerge from this pandemic and everything going on in our country right now?
I again, great question, Thomas, because I think I get to engage with so many extraordinary leaders and businesses across the country. You know, what I think that one of the main things in terms of transformation that I see is businesses, community leaders leaning into their power. And what I mean by that is these systems will only shift as far as we push them. And what I've been really excited to see is that there are businesses that have reconsidered what does it look like to have their relationship with their employees, as an example. I've seen places in which there's been enough instigation and agitation, again, from businesses and leaders on the ground to consider things like community investment trusts, right? That allow for community, neighborhood level ownership of real estate, of collective business opportunities. I've seen so much of that happening over the last year. But again, the reason why I say I want to emphasize that it's being led by the actual entrepreneurs and businesses, right? It's being led by and driven by these communities. It's not because major corporation or government entity says we're going to do this, right? And so I know that resonates with so many folks that have been participating in it. So that's what I get really excited by, and I just want to make sure that in that conversation, to your question, just emphasize how astronomically important business leaders, and again I say business like of all stripes, but I'm also really speaking specifically, Thomas, to the scrappy small mid-sized business. Like your efforts matter. I've seen how things shift because of those efforts. And so I just want to make sure I address that, Thomas, in terms of like really emphasizing just how it makes a material difference.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, once again, Rodney, we're just so grateful for your time, your work, and your team. Sending you the warmest thoughts as we continue forward doing this work, and proud to partner with you. So thank you so much for your time today, and it's been a privilege to have you join us.
Thank you.